Good evening. Thanks for joining us this evening. We are going to take a look again into Joseph's life this evening. So if you have your Bibles, you want to have those with you. We're going to be spending most of our time in Genesis chapter 40, looking at Joseph's time in prison. So where we last left Joseph, he was accused of attempted rape of Potiphar's wife, which was obviously not true. But that was what Potiphar's wife accused him of, and Potiphar was so angry that it appears that he took her side. But as the captain of the guard, or other way to translate that is also the one who carries out executions, he would have understood the laws, and the laws in Egypt were this type of offense, attempted rape, was punishable by death. But he doesn't kill Joseph. He puts him in prison, and as far as history goes, there's not a lot of evidence that people were put in prison, and the prison time served was itself a punishment. But it appears that Joseph was put in prison and was there for a long time. Remember, when he got sold to Potiphar, he was 17. And then when he begins his service for Pharaoh, he's 30-something. So he's in this prison for some time that would be longer than expected. Now, the reason they did have prisons usually was that people were sent there awaiting their execution or awaiting a time when a decision could be made. But they weren't held there indefinitely, and they weren't held there very long before judgment would be passed. So it appears this prison that he's sent to is also on Potiphar's land. This would have been a place described as being Potiphar's house, or the house of the captain of the guard. Chapter 40 and verse 3. Says, Pharaoh put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. And again in chapter 41 it mentions the same thing. So Potiphar is the captain of the guard, and if he was so upset with Joseph, he could have had him executed, he could have had him sent far away, but it appears that he sees some value in keeping Joseph around. And while he's there, we see that God continues to bless him. If we want to start with his confinement, it starts really in chapter 39 and verse 20, where Potiphar puts him into prison, where the king's prisoners are confined. So that should be already a suggestion that this just isn't any prison. This isn't the place where they would just put any vagabond. This is a place where the king's prisoners are sent. And he was there in prison. Verse 21 reminds us, though, that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Some versions say loving kindness or mercy. It's that word chesed, which has that idea of covenant loyalty. God is showing that covenant loyalty, that covenant love to Joseph, which suggests this kind of relationship. God showed him that steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the warden, the keeper of the prison. So it was God who was moving behind the scenes to continue to care for and protect Joseph. Now, if you were Joseph, you might wonder, okay, this doesn't feel like steadfast love. But what we have to remember in our lives, especially when we're going through difficult situations, is that just because we're in a difficult situation, that in and of itself does not mean that God does not love us. He still cares for us, and He is still with us even in the worst situations. Well, we're told that God is with Joseph, and verse 22 of 39 says, whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. Joseph himself was the one who did it. To the extent that the jailer, the warden, put everything in Joseph's hands, and again paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, in a similar way to when Potiphar put everything into Joseph's hand. And when it was put into Joseph's hand, it prospered. So it's almost here at the end of the chapter 39, it's a repeat of God blessing him and making things prosper under him at the beginning, that we saw at the beginning of chapter 39. So they're kind of a mirror of one another. Now chapter 40, I'll read the first 4 verses just so you get an idea of who's here. It says, sometime after when Joseph was arrested and put in this prison, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in the custody of the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in his custody. So here are the king's own prisoners, the men he sent to prison, and if the captain of the guard, the warden, if they want to be sure that these men are taken care of while Pharaoh is making up his mind, they're going to do whatever's best for them, and that means putting them in Joseph's care. So Joseph is ministering to these 2 men. A cupbearer is a person who would bring beverages to the king. The baker would obviously bake breads and cakes, and they would bring those to the king. They're positions that are very they would be only given to people who the king or the Pharaoh trusted very much, and suggesting to us that because they're put into prison at the same time, there must have been something that happened that made Pharaoh decide one of these 2 men have tried to kill me or have betrayed me, and maybe he can't decide who it is. It's either the cupbearer or the baker, and this kind of betrayal makes sense when we understand the closeness of the relationship and the amount of trust that Pharaoh would put into these 2 people. Well, more time passes here, and it tells us in verse 5, one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt. They both had 2 dreams, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now, verse 6, Joseph realizes these 2 men that he's responsible for are dejected, out of sorts. Now, they were the highest positions. They were officials in the king's house, the chief cupbearer, the chief baker, and now they've been sent to prison with threat of death. And yet, while Joseph is taking care of them, he's close enough to them to recognize how depressed and dejected they might be when they got there, and how suddenly dejected or out of sorts they are this day when they've woken up after they've had this bad dream. Now, the word here for dejected is used one other time in Daniel, whenever the eunuch is wanting Daniel and his friends to eat the meat of the king, and he was worried that they would look dejected. In other words, it had more to do with how they looked. They looked ill or in poor condition. So these 2 men here with Joseph most likely looked sad, surely. They looked troubled, but it had some effect on their physical condition as well. And you might wonder why. They just had these dreams. What's got them so worried? Well, pagans believed that their gods used dreams to warn them about their future. And it was something that happened so often that kings and pharaohs, they would have interpreters of dreams around them. Now these 2 men no longer had access to these dream interpreters. If you read verse 7 Joseph asked the two men, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said, "We've had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." So they're more worried about the messages in these dreams. They're a warning, but there's no one here to interpret because they don't have access to the Pharaoh's interpreter. So that's got them out of sorts. But Joseph, unexpectedly to them, he's in prison and he has access to God Almighty, who knows all things. And so he says, "Tell me your dreams." He says in verse 8, "Do not all interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So he's making a point, it's God who knows what these things mean. Why don't you tell me your dreams? And he's obviously offering to interpret them. So the cupbearer tells his dream first, and he sees a vine with 3 branches, and the branches, it seems in quick succession, they bud, they bloom, they ripen into grapes really quickly. And then again, really quickly, he takes the grapes, he sees a cup in his hand, he squeezes the grapes in the cup, and he puts it into the cup into Pharaoh's hands. So again, this wouldn't have normally happened that quickly. If you think about how long it takes for grapes to grow, and then again for the grapes to become fermented before they are served to the king, it would happen really quickly. So a cupbearer might be in charge of the vine and handing the cup to Pharaoh and all of these things, but what was strange about the dream is that it happened very quickly. There was no time for the normal progression before it happened. So it may have been a dream that is familiar to cupbearers. I don't know. Most of the time when I dream, it's something that's common, something that I'm used to going on. But the thing that would have stood out, I think, was it was happening very quickly. Well, Joseph immediately tells him the meaning. He doesn't say, "Let me take some time." He doesn't say, "Let me study on this." The difference between Joseph here and the dream interpreters is these men would have been used to the dream interpreter presenting themselves as a highly skilled person who has learned a craft or an art, and they know how to interpret dreams through symbology and things like this. But Joseph just immediately goes and tells the dream. He says, "This is the interpretation." Immediately after he tells the dream, so there's no waiting there. He tells him that the 3 branches are 3 days, and he says this means that the cupbearer will be restored and serve Pharaoh just in the same way that he used to. In fact, it appears that Joseph is so sure. In verse 14, he says, "Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." So Joseph is so sure that this is going to happen after he hears the dream that he asks a favor of the cupbearer, asks him to show him a kindness, a chesed, like God was showing to Joseph by mentioning Joseph to Pharaoh to get him out of that house, out of this place where Potiphar has put him. He goes through, and we get a little bit of insight as to Joseph's perspective on what he's been going through so far. We don't hear from Joseph a lot, but here in verse 15, he says, "I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews." So that's how he feels about being sold by his brothers, that he was taken out of the land. And he doesn't mention that he was sold by his brothers, but that he was taken forcibly by the Ishmaelites. Obviously, he knows his brothers sold him, but he feels more that he was taken away than pushed away, sent away. He was taken away by these Ishmaelites, and he's done nothing. So he knows he's innocent. He's done nothing that they should put me into a pit. In other words, there's no reason I should be receiving any punishment. Well, verse 16, we see the chief baker hears the interpretation and he likes it. So he decides to share his own dream with Joseph. And he says on his head he had 3 baskets of bread, and the top basket had all kinds of baked goods in it. Ancient hieroglyphs in Egypt show up to 38 different kinds of cake and 57 kinds of bread. They loved bread. This bread is described as being a white bread, so it would have been one that was worked harder to get all the grit out and possibly bleached. So it would have been a delicacy here that he was taking this bread to Pharaoh. And it was probably normal for the baker to carry bread like this to Pharaoh. So why is it strange? Well, it's strange because the birds are eating that bread right off of the baker's head, right out of the basket. And it's not Pharaoh that's eating the bread, but these birds. And again, Joseph immediately tells the meaning of the dream. He doesn't hide the truth of the dream. He doesn't sugarcoat it. In other words, when God gives him the interpretation, he faithfully represents God by sharing the truth, all the truth. And we can see in that something to emulate. When we have the truth, we don't need to sugarcoat it. We don't need to water it down. We need to faithfully represent God by sharing the whole truth. When we know somebody's doing something wrong and we have the opportunity, what are we going to do? Are we going to sugarcoat it, or are we going to faithfully represent God and give truth in a loving and kind way? Verse 18 and 19, he gives this interpretation. He says that the 3 baskets, they represent 3 days. So 3 days for the baker and 3 days for the cupbearer. But for the baker, he says, Pharaoh will lift up your head, or lift it off, and impale you. Literally, it's hang you on a tree. So he's going to be hung on a tree, and the punishment was usually hanging by impaling the body on a wooden pole. So hanging on a tree would fit into that description. And the birds will eat your flesh. Whenever somebody was executed in this way, a lot of times it was for everyone else to see, so that they wouldn't make the same mistake. So they would be left on that pole, and of course the scavengers would come and eat the rest of the body. And that's what Joseph is suggesting that's going to happen to this man. Now, 3 days later, Pharaoh throws himself a birthday party, and he has a feast for all of his officials. Now, this includes the butler and the baker, although they're probably not invited in the same way everybody else is invited. They're invited to find out what their fate is. But because this large group of officials is there, it makes sense for Pharaoh to say, this is what's going to happen if you betray me, and this is what's going to happen if you're loyal to me. And so the butler represents, or the cupbearer represents, the person who is loyal, and the baker is the person who has betrayed him and gets this punishment. So the butler gets his job back while the baker is hung. Now, this is just the way that God had given their interpretations to them. Now the chapter ends on kind of a sad note. Verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. He's been in this prison for so many years, and it's 2 years from this time to when the cupbearer actually remembers Joseph. That's a long time for you to be sitting in a pit, in a dungeon, in a prison, waiting for someone to give the news. I'm sure he felt forgot about. Perhaps he thought that maybe the cupbearer did tell Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just didn't care. But what do we know about Joseph throughout all of this? We don't know how he felt when he was forgotten. We don't know what he went through. We don't know the kind of personal struggles with faith that he was going through, his own feelings of dejection. But we do know that he remained faithful. He could have thought when he was there, I got sold into slavery and I was just doing what God would have me do. I got sent to prison. I was just doing what God would have me do. And every time I'm put in a bad situation, it's through my own hard work and diligence that I get these high positions. So forget about God. He could have thought that. He could have thought that following God was actually what led him to slavery and imprisonment. And sometimes we do go through dark times and dark places as we're following God. But he wants us to stay with him. And Joseph didn't give up on God. We don't know what he was going through. All we can look at is verse 15 here. What he says is, I was carried off, I've done nothing wrong. And we know that he was treated unjustly. Joseph knew that he was treated unjustly, but he still was faithful to God. And you might wonder, okay, how do you know that he was faithful to God? Think about Genesis 39, verse 21 and 23. In both of those places it tells us that the Lord was with Joseph. God was with Joseph, and Joseph knew it. Whenever the prisoners have a dream, Joseph trusts God to give an interpretation of that dream. And he trusts that that interpretation is going to be true. He tells the cupbearer, immediately tells him his interpretation, and then immediately says, when this happens, please remember me. So he still trusts God. He's still faithful to God. And also remember that these are not the only dreams that Joseph has had experience with God interpreting. When Joseph was back in his own homeland, he had his own dreams about him and his brothers bowing down to him, and those things have not come to pass yet. So he knows here that God makes dreams come true in chapter 40. If he is so sure about it here in chapter 40, and again we'll see in chapter 41, then he must have confidence and faith in God that he is still going to bring about the promised future that he saw in his dreams when he was younger. Now, what that tells me is not that I should be necessarily writing down all my dreams and praying to God for interpretations, but we need to realize that we do not know our future. We don't know right now, in the terrible situation we're in, we don't know what God has planned for us in the future. No matter what we're going through, we can always feel bad about ourselves and pity ourselves, or we can look to God and remain faithful to him and trust him that he knows what's best and he cares and loves us, cares for us and loves us even when we're in this terrible situation. We don't know the future, but God does. And God wants something good to come about for his people. And I don't know about you, but even if everything just got worse and worse today, to the end of my life, I know that God has promised me a bright future, an eternal future with him and his son in heaven forever. And if I can continue to hope on that, I can get through anything. James chapter 4 tells us, reminds us that we don't know what tomorrow will bring. And that's true. But what we do know is that we have a God that we can trust in. And any of his promises, anything that he's promised us, will come true. And the hope that we have there can pull us through anything. Thanks for joining us tonight on this Genesis chapter 40, this third session on the study of Joseph. I'll talk to you guys later.